Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm very excited to be discussing this topic with you. So I also want to start with sort of a humble note, right? There's many different versions of technology and many different forms of innovation, so take this all with a huge grain of salt. This is the place that I'm coming from, and I look forward to hearing your many different perspectives on this as well. As my biosketch, as you highlighted in my biosketch, I am a behavioral scientist by training, and so I tend to focus mostly on behavioral interventions using different digital tools. So just please be mindful of that as part of the perspective I bring for this. So first I want to thank my colleagues and funders, and I also want to acknowledge the disclaimer of these different groups that I'm a scientific advisor to. So I want to start with what I'm going to end with, which is takeaways, as we were all asked to give. A hype evidence gap definitely does exist within the realm of digital health. I want to unpack that quite a bit. Plausible reasons is that there's a disconnect between the operations versus the concepts that we're studying, and also a mismatch between the methods and the complexity of the problems. What to do? In my opinion, they're placing greater emphasis on understanding operations over concepts is really important. A second is, I think, the work of Judea Pearl, particularly related to causal models, is a very important part of moving forward, and I'll get into this quite a bit more. And last two parts is make it agile and make it science. That's an area that I've been thinking a lot about. So I'll unpack each one of these. So knowing that I only have 30 minutes here, let me just get into this. So this is just one example of a nice example of the split between the hype versus the evidence. And you might have seen this article. It came out in 2016. It was by John Jakisik and others. You can see this is a JAMA article, effective a wearable technology combined with a lifestyle intervention, long-term weight loss. And you'll notice here that it was a randomized controlled trial comparing, see at the bottom, the objective, standard behavioral weight loss intervention, standard intervention, to a, quote, technology-enhanced weight loss intervention or an enhanced intervention, okay? If you don't know the punchline of this, the punchline is basically, according to popular press and other thing, the technology doesn't work, okay? So let's unpack this quite a bit, though, because I think there's actually a lot of lessons that can be learned from this study in particular to work forward. And also, let me give a disclaimer here. I actually have a published response about this paper in JAMA, and also I am actually a huge fan of John Jakisik's work. I think this study actually had quite a bit of rigor, but you'll notice that I think I had more of a bone to pick with the difference between the operationalization of what they tested versus the concepts. So, but moving forward. So what do I mean by this mismatch between a concept and an operation? Well, so here's the concept that was used. A wearable device, okay? And you can see, literally, this is what JAMA said you should tell the press about this, okay? Or you even saw in the objective statement, technology-enhanced intervention, okay? Those are concepts, okay? So now let me show you what the operation was. The operation is, how did you actually operationally define this? You know, how did you measure it? How did you enact the intervention, right? Classic difference between the abstract idea we want to be studying and the concrete thing we have to study in a scientific study, right? So this is what they studied in this trial. This is called the body media armband. A few things to note about this device. It's discontinued. It actually was discontinued in 2015. So prior to this study being published, you could not get access to the technology that was tested in the JAMA article. So that's an important thing to note. But then note, here's something else, and we'll get to this later. These are all feasibly wearable devices, right? You can see the Fitbit, the Apple Watch, a continuous glucose monitor, the Dexcom device, tandem insulin pump. These are some new ones coming from UCSD, from the Center for Wearable Sensors. So these are all wearable devices feasibly, right? Are you starting to see a disconnect, right, between the concept and the operationalization? That's really important. But now here, let me just drive this forward a little bit farther with potentially the problem with how we think about and how we label things, the concept that we want to be studying. So this, again, this is right out of JAMA. This is what they said, told the press. You know, and I'm sorry, I'm just focusing on the punchline, but if you go underneath it, it's not, they don't dig into as much depth as I would want. So use of a wearable device does not improve weight loss. And so what does this mean in the popular press. And so I just did a quick Google search of this particular study and to find a few. So here was one where basically it kind of sounds like what Jamma said. Wearable technology may not help you lose weight. But then here's some more. What we suspected about Fitbits all along is true. Wearable exercise trackers don't make people any more active, a flurry of new studies finds. So there's actually 2 studies from the flurry, and one of them doesn't use a Fitbit. Okay. And then here, this one I love. Sorry, your fitness tracker is probably useless. Is this fair? Is this an appropriate statement from that randomized control trial? That's an important question. Is this actually facilitating a thoughtful conversation on how these things are working? I would argue no, right? And I think this is partially our fault as scientists. We need to think through this, and I'll get into a lot of reasons why. But at a high level, this is the question that's really important. Are these things the same? Okay, what do I mean? So first, pharmaceuticals. So I just put generics here, right? Statins, aspirin, ACE inhibitors. Are these the same? No, we're expecting they have different mechanisms of action, right? Are these the same? Or do you think they might have different mechanisms of action? They might, right? Probably how we design them probably has an impact, okay? Now, so I'm gonna get into more details on kind of where we move forward with this, but one of the things that I've been kind of obsessed with is sort of within my field. I've always been inspired by the work of Shadish, Cook, and Campbell in their 2002 book. And one of the things they just talk about is generalized causal inference as a key target that we want to work forward towards. Now, as I think about this, I think the generalized and the causal inference is really important. The key question is, how do we get there? And I think this actually, I hope David Allison will continue on this with his rigor presentation next. So, but first, let's just start with, I think one of the questions and one of the risks that I think we as scientists have classically had is a hope and a desire and almost a need for our own careers to make overgeneralized claims. Right? If you go back to that JAMA article, it would have been pretty boring to say, what we did is we ran a randomized control trial with a technology that's no longer used and that nobody wore, and we found out that it didn't work compared to a really rigorous weight loss trial. Because that's what you found. Okay? Is that an interesting punchline? No, it's not. Okay? Now, I actually think there's a lot that that was learned mechanistically about that, but that's different from what the story was, right? Or even the objective of it, right? I think part of that comes down to a love affair of generalization, okay? So this is the classic statistical models that we tend to think about, right? I'm sure you've all seen this, right? There's a target population that we care about, this one as an example, all school children in the UK, many millions, and then of course there's the study population, a smaller, more accessible group of school children, and then ultimately there's the sample, the people that you actually get data from, right? And what we want to be able to do is statistically understand how that sample is representative of the target population, and we use inferential statistics for this, right? All sounds familiar. Now, what if people, place, and time matter? If people, place, and time matter, then literally that actually becomes an essential element of the causal model. And I'm going to get into this quite a bit more, but I'm going to give you an example in my own world. I tend to think a lot about physical activity interventions, and so imagine you send someone a text message and you say, hey, go for a walk. Think for a moment about what is the context and the state of mind you need to be in for a text message sent to you to say go to a walk to get you to actually go for a walk. Right? You probably need to have the opportunity to go for a walk, right? This is the one of these 3 variables. Maybe you need to be at a relatively low level of stress, right? Because if you're too stressed, you're gonna be like, I don't wanna go for a walk. Or maybe you're someone who, you're so stressed you wanna go for a walk. So there's an interesting flip. Literally the exact same variable might respond differently depending on who you are. And by the way, I have data to support that, but we can come back to that later. And then finally, maybe you're someone that only likes to go for a walk if someone else will go for a walk, right? So this literally has nothing to do with the intervention of a text message to go for a walk. It has to do with the preconditions. And notice, that is part of the causal model, okay? That is very different from our classic way of thinking about generalization. And I'm going to get into how we actually handle this, but I just want you to sit with that as a problem space, right? Like when we're doing randomized controlled trials, when we're doing our work, we're trying to basically get a causal inference, but it doesn't necessarily make sense if we don't actually understand the context. Okay, so beyond that, another part of this to understand is also that what we need to understand is the mechanisms and what is actually being enacted. So if you go back into the Jakisik article, the argument was basically that it would be a low burden form of self-monitoring and that would result in weight loss. Their control condition was actually a highly active self-monitoring intervention, paper-based, and so it basically forced them to think a lot more about it. So when I describe it that way, do the results sound surprising anymore? That the really active form of self-monitoring worked better than a low-burden one that people stopped using? No, right? The results actually make a lot of sense, but the conversation is very different because now we're focused mechanistically. I actually think that's really fascinating, and that I think is teaching us something scientifically. And so I do think there was something that was learned from that article. I just don't think it was framed that way. But let's continue down this path, right? Then there's the Fitbits, right? And the question is, if you give someone steps per day self-monitoring, will that result in weight loss? I don't know. Well, at least now we have a clear articulation of what the mechanism is. And then let's say the Apple Watch, right? You can see the circles. This is like a total activity self-monitoring. Will that result in weight loss? Alone, maybe not. Maybe we need to combine it with other things. But at least now we have clarity on what the purpose is of each one of those components, right? So as I think about the state of technology and innovation, what I think I think actually the most important thing is actually the science needs to be advancing to be able to handle the subtlety of these technologies. And I think this study is a perfect example of it. We are driven towards generalization, but what we really need to understand is mechanism. Okay, and so this is old. I'm going to now go into some old classic stuff on this because in some ways I think we're going back to the future. The technology is now just about catching up to allow us to actually handle some very old concepts related to causality and whatnot. And in particular, one of the ones that I really like is this concept of an INUS condition. That is an acronym, if you don't know what it is, INUS. But it's basically this idea of mixing together preconditions and mechanisms of action. And so before I get into this, let me just tell you the story. This came from J.L. Mackie in 1964. Again, so back to the future. But this is the idea. Imagine you're a home insurance inspector and you go in and you have to figure out what, quote, caused a house fire. Okay, so you go into a house and you look around and you're like, aha, it was that short-circuited wire. That caused the fire. Well, so what Mackie kind of asked the question is, okay, yeah, great. That caused the fire, but did it really cause the fire? Well, yes and no. First of all, it was probably, and this is the INUS condition, it was insufficient, but it was necessary. What is that saying? It's basically saying, yes, that it was necessary in that if it weren't there, the fire probably wouldn't start it. But it was also insufficient. Why is that? This is the idea of preconditions. Other things needed to be present. There needed to be oxygen in the air. There needed to be something that was combustible. There perhaps also, and this is funky from a causality perspective, there had to be a lack of something, like a lack of a sprinkler system that would put it out, right? They might have also had to have a broken circuit breaker, because otherwise that would have shut the electricity off, right? Get the idea? These are preconditions, that if those constellation of events didn't happen at the same time, that fire would have never occurred. So they were preconditions, insufficient but necessary. But then the other part, and this is about the mechanism of action, part of a condition which itself is, and this is a clever flip on words that confuses everyone, unnecessary but sufficient. Okay, so there's the INUS. Okay, so what is the part about this? So unnecessary but sufficient. This is saying that, think about that house fire, like a short circuit. Okay, so is a short circuit the only way for you to, let's assume you have all of those preconditions that I just described. Is a short circuit the only way that you could have caused that fire? No, there are other ways. A candle could have fallen over, a cigarette butt could have fallen down, lightning could have struck the house, right? Each one of those things is an operationalization. Now here, remember, operation versus concept, right? Each one of those is an operationalization of a concept, a mechanism of action, right? In the Mackie story, it's a law of thermodynamics, right? You basically had a combustible material. The key question is, how do we discover those fundamental laws? And are we going to be able to discover something as complex as what the kind of stuff we're working on if we're ignoring preconditions and we're getting confused about the difference between an operationalization versus an abstract concept? Okay? This is all built into really old school conceptualizations of causality. I just want to remind us all that this actually exists. And I think that what I see us moving forward on is actually allowing us to unpack this, unpack preconditions and unpack the difference between abstract concepts versus operationalizations. And I'll go through this when I go into the more how, but I'm setting up the problem statement. Just to go even deeper, I mentioned this book before, the Schottish, Cook, and Campbell. The way they describe this is the difference between a causal descriptive versus an explanatory model. So what do I mean by causal descriptive model? In essence, imagine that what you want to do is you want to figure out, if you flip a switch and it turns on and off a light, right? So you can run your variation of a randomized control trial and you flick your switch 1,000 times, and every time it's up, the light's on, every time it's down, it's off, right? This basically gives you a sense on if there is an effect, okay? Right? But it doesn't give you any insight on how that effect actually happened, right? The how is the really important question. And if you go into and read up in their work, I mean, what they argue is basically, even if we're striving for generalization, the most powerful generalized tool is a causal explanatory model, when you know how something actually works. And so it's basically like, instead of knowing how the light switch work, you actually understand how the power was generated, how that got transferred through to you, how it went through your circuit breaker, how when you closed the switch, that allowed the electricity to flow from wherever it was produced to go up into the light. When it goes into the light, you have a light bulb that has a tungsten filament in it within a noble gas, and as the electricity goes through that tungsten thing, you actually have light emitted, right? Think about the difference and distinction of those two things. I flick a switch and I get a sense of if it works, or I know how that light is produced. Think about the power of generalization that you get when you actually understand how. Okay? So that to me is actually the key focus. And in my mind, when I look at the future of innovation and technology, we are moving and we are actually increasingly getting the ability to actually study the how. Okay. So now just to wrap it up, and again, I am a fan of John Jakisik's work. I'm not trying to derail. I don't think that this is his fault. I actually think he did a really deep mechanistic work. I think we are incentivized to try to write these papers that are overgeneralized that I don't think actually are good for the science. So going back, this was the comparison, right? Basically a low burden, quote unquote, thing that no one used compared to an active self-monitoring. So the question is, how might design of the operations impact the results? I hope you can see that actually they probably had a big impact, right? Imagine maybe that his mechanism of action was a low burden self-monitoring. Maybe he needed a different device that was more low burden to actually test the mechanism that he was striving for. He never got past that first level of causality. And then, of course, the other side, what are the preconditions for this to be used? There might be some people that thing would be low burden for, whereas others, it might, that probably was highly burdensome. This was actually with college students. Do you think college students would want a big armband on their arm all the time? Probably not, right? So that's part of the problem. Okay, so this is the problem side, right? Basically, I think there's a disconnect between operations and concepts. And then I also think there's a mismatch between methods and problem complexity. So now the question is, what do you do? Well, I like this quote here. So most scientists are not trained today on the basics of epistemology or logic. We need to go back to work on the basics. And in some ways, I hope you can see that's what I was just starting to go. But I actually also think this is where we're going in the future. What I'm seeing in terms of innovation and technology is that a lot of people are asking these basic questions again, right? And so some of it just comes back to some basic logic, like knowing that these things are not the same, right? And therefore, they might have different mechanisms of actions. They also might have different preconditions on when they'll be useful versus not useful. And that actually is important for understanding and doing science around them. We can't ignore those things. But oftentimes, unintentionally, with the kind of science that we've been doing, because we've been asking if, then, flick the switch kind of studies, we actually miss out on understanding how they actually work. And so all that stuff is actually averaged out in the wash. Okay? So then the second thing, of course, this is then manifest in terms of we often ignore all of those intermediary steps with our work and only focus on the outcomes. Okay? And so that's just kind of reformulating the problem. So then what to do? Well, in my mind, one of the key things is now just going back to basics of science, measurement is really key. And I think there's been some great work, but conceptually I want to set it up with this. Knowing that the time scale of a measurement is really key. And so now I actually gave a separate talk in the Netherlands, a keynote a few weeks ago, and it was all about collaboration, crossing chasms between academia, industry, between disciplines, between professionals and patients and whatnot. But at its, if you want, you can go to another we can chat more about that when we go. But this is one of the messages that I had from that of you can sort of think about the way I tend to think about this is, academia and epidemiology, we've classically started from death and gone backwards. Right, like death is the most important thing, and we're trying to reduce that or increase life years. Now, industry tends to start from a single interaction and move forward. Right, and so what we do is we actually the understanding the time scale, like when do we expect a meaningful detection of change to occur, is really important. Right, so let's just go back to that little text message intervention of let me nudge you to go for a walk. Right, you can imagine I send you a prompt to go for a walk, and then if you're just thinking causally, right, if they don't read it, is that thing going to have an impact? No, probably not. So that's important to pay attention to. If they read it, do they actually appreciate it? If they appreciate it, did they actually act on it? Right? There's so many levels that thing could have broken, right? If they act on it, did they actually do something that was clinically meaningful, like take a 10-minute walk, for example? And then does that translate into steps per day? Does that translate into physical activity guidelines? Does that translate into improving your VO2? Does that influence cardiovascular disease and death, right? So creating some logical link from a single interaction to death is actually really valuable. And the sweet spot, and I think this is where I'm seeing a lot of the science going, is actually working right in that middle range from between variables that are meaningful and can be linked to slower timescale concepts with to the single interaction. So things that you can measure at like an hour, at a day, maybe a week level. That gives you a lot of strength, both from a perspective of partnering with industry as this sets up, but also from a science standpoint, it allows you to actually get closer to understanding those mechanisms of action. And so now getting back into the technology side, how do you measure mechanisms of action? And I think there's actually a lot of advancements going on, particularly the continuous glucose monitor system. This is Dexcom's, but there's many others. I'm not trying to advocate for Dexcom or any others. It was just an illustrative example. This is a pretty amazing device. I mean, think about the type of information you're getting from a continuous glucose monitor. There's a lot of interesting signal beyond just that glucose level that we could be detecting from that. These are also some things from UCSD, the Center for Wearable Sensors, clinical trial tattoo sensor. Again, this is another version of CGM, or another one that actually is an alcohol monitor. This one's really interesting. A colleague of mine, Todd Coleman, in his lab, the Neural Interaction Lab, you can say electrical digestive engineering. He's actually been trying to look at this to actually understand what is going physiologically within your gut. And so he's actually been studying celiac with this. And it's just amazing some of the sensors and whatnot that can get into this. And then finally, there's also ones just in terms of behavior. There's been a lot of movement going on using these wearables, but actually figuring out eating detection. So basically, can you move and pick up when someone is actually, chewing or something of that using a fork? And this is being done at Northwestern. So why am I bringing these up? Notice that these things are actually getting closer to these fast timescales where we can actually start getting into mechanisms. There's actually many more examples. I'm just trying to set up that there's actually quite a bit of movement going on within this. And there's even more. Now, beyond just the biology of this, there's another area of work. This is the NIH-funded group, MD2K, Mobile Data to Knowledge. Each one of these have actually been coming up with digital signatures to measure these things, from fatigue and stress and eating, TV viewing, craving, smoking. These are concepts that they're trying to pick up more objectively, not through self-report. Similarly, this is a group up at University of Washington, the UbiComp lab. They've been doing things related to SpiroSmart, coughing, and the like. And then this one, actually, Tom Insel, former director of the NIMH, he's got his own company going now, but he's been really a strong advocate of digital phenotyping. Particularly, there's been some early work showing that you might actually be able to detect concepts like depression with the way that you type and text within your phone. Basically, that digital keyboard of yours has a lot of hidden signals about how depressed you are. At least that's the current hypothesis. Now, is that actually true? Again, that's an interesting question, but that is actually into this, right? So notice here that beyond even just the stuff that might be behaviorally overtly measurable, there are things that we are also starting to be able to infer from the actions and the digital traces that we have, right? So going back to this in terms of that time scale, right? If we can start to actually articulate a mechanism of action, well, now we can start to study it, right? But now the other question is, what is the science that allows us to put all this together? And in my view, Judea Pearl's work is a really important part of this process. And this is a popular press book that just came out called The Book of Why. If you don't know who Judea Pearl is, he is a computer scientist who is very well known for his work on causality. He also invented Bayesian networks, which is basically the backbone of artificial intelligence. So, what is his basically take-home message around cause and effect relationships? The short summary is the value of causal models, and having a distinction between what you might be testing statistically versus what you're trying to study causally. And so he actually unpacks quite a bit of things, and he basically says there's a lot of power with just drawing some dots and some arrows, basically. Now, there's a lot more thought behind this than that, and I'll even show you some of the math, but like, here's a very simple example. And anyone who has any relationship with public health knows this story of Dr. Snow and the water and whatnot, right? And so, basically, what was the thing that was predicting cholera? There was this idea that it was miasma as a concept, right? But he was like, no, I think it actually has to do with water purity. And notice that there were these two different water sources. The water companies, one that was below the river Thames, where basically all the sewage was getting into the water, versus another one that was getting their water above where the sewage went in. And he basically said, oh, this is an interesting test, and was kind of showing this. Of course, we always hear it was the one spigot, but actually the real science was more around this, right? Drawing this out is valuable because it helps you to make an assertion about what do you think is actually causally going on. Now, this is a simple example. These can get more and more complex, right? Here's another one. This was basically when the whole debate going on about smoking was occurring. Fischer, the inventor of the randomized control trial, he was a big smoker, and he didn't like the idea of people saying that smoking was bad for you. And so he basically said, there's probably this smoking gene that's causing all of this, and we can't, it's not actually the problem, right? So this actually allows you to set up the assertion on what causally is going on. It's different than statistically. Actually, Judea Pearl talks about in terms of 3 rungs of causality: association, intervention, and then counterfactual. And he basically makes an argument that much of our science right now is living only in rung 1 of this ladder of causality association. And we need to be moving towards the rung 2 and rung 3 level of intervention. And it's basically bound around this. And then just to show that there's actually a fair bit of math that goes behind this, there's ways that he's been working out to try to understand how do you actually take a causal model and then unpack it to understand how you can truly study the causality. So not just saying that there's a covariate or there's a confounder, but what if you have an assertion about how the causality works? How do you actually make sure that you don't unintentionally take a mediator and control for it and then therefore kill your causal model? Right? Or you don't control for something when it actually is a mediator. You get the idea, right? Actually carefully handling confounders is really important. And he's been developing this do calculus. This is what he's been calling it as a structure, right? So now why does this matter? Why is this important for us to move forward on, right? So in my own work, we've been thinking a lot about this. We've been inspired by his model for a while. We do work with control systems engineering. An essential part of control systems engineering is basically establishing your belief about how the world works. And so this is, within behavioral science, there's a popular theory called social cognitive theory. This is basically the visual version of it. But all of this is mathematically specified, like on exactly what the model structure is, how these variables are interrelated. And it gives you a lot of strength, basically not because we're right, but to be explicit about our assumptions. And let me just be really clear about that. The most important thing here is not so much that we're right, but that we were really explicit about what our assumptions are. So that whenever we vet this relative to data, we can check our assumptions. Oftentimes we're not forced to actually be this specific on how the world is working, and therefore we basically don't have a good, and this is a Bayesian framing, we don't have a good prior to then update into a posterior. And what that means is it makes it hard for us to ask anything beyond the if-style questions, with causal descriptive models. Okay, so now it also is valuable though because it allows us to then, even without data, and this is key, right? It's all about assumptions, right? We can test our assumptions even without having data initially, right? So in our model, a key concept in social cognitive theory is self-efficacy. Basically, are you confident enough to go exercise? So we can test what is the world like in this model if someone has low self-efficacy versus high self-efficacy, and how does the behavior look different? And mathematically, we can run this, and if that didn't look right to us, Well, we knew something was wrong. Like, that doesn't fit with intuition. Now, is this right? Of course not. You also need data. But isn't that interesting that we can have that much level of specificity? In my mind, a lot of the innovative work is actually just getting into forcing us to be clear about what we're studying and why, the mechanisms of the work. And then moving forward, again, this is some of my own work, there are ways to actually study these dynamic hypotheses. The approach within control systems engineering is called system identification. Basically, if you're in this model, if you have a hypothesis that you can have sort of an ambitious but doable step goal, meaning that you want to try to help someone meet a step goal that is ambitious enough so that they always feel challenged, but not so ambitious that they don't meet it, right? How do you actually find that? You can use methods from system identification to do this, where basically what you need to do is, your question is not, does this intervention work? We have plenty of data to show that goal setting is a valuable approach. What we need to understand is how it works. And so what we need is variability on what happens when you give you really high goals when you're stressed versus not. What happens when you give you really low goals when you're stressed and not. And just imagine unpacking this from that causal model. When you have all of this, you can then start to actually vet, not if the intervention works, that's a causal descriptive question. You can ask, how does this work? You vet the model, okay? So it's a very different style of question, and I think this is where a lot of the work has been going. And so we've been moving forward to actually test this. Now, another thing that I think is really interesting is knowing this is a crazy complex diagram, right? Can you study all of this in one experiment? Probably not. Well, we couldn't figure it out. Maybe you can figure it out. We couldn't do it. But what it does do is, if you actually articulate all these meaningful pathways, what you can say is, well, I'm studying this piece of this causal model here, and this other study is studying it here, right? It gives you a different way beyond the classic forms of meta-analysis to actually aggregate these things. So I think there's a lot of interest about trying to move forward with this, and this is something I've been seeing moving forward. Now, the last element on this is also, I've also been using this a lot within my agile science work, which is another, I've been trying to think through how to basically get our science to better match the complexity of this problem, as I hope you're hearing. And so we've been using causal diagrams a lot, really just as a form of communication. It just forces specification on what your assumptions are. And so this is a really simple one of like, well, how do you think the MyFitnessPal app could actually influence weight loss? Right? Notice here that with the previous one, there was just these one little line, but as we just unpacked just that one little thing, we're like, oh my gosh, there's so many different plausible ways that that thing could actually, that one little app could feasibly have an impact, right? So one, it forces us to actually, it allows us to understand the assumptions we're making, but two, it allows us to communicate it with one another, right? And what I have been founding, and I'll just give you this as an example, I ran a training workshop in 2017 at San Diego, and what we did is we did we had people from all sorts of different disciplines. So, we had microbiome folks within there, we were having, engineers, we had health scientists, we had nurses, we had behavioral scientists. I mean, it was a very diverse group focused on N of 1 work. And the long and the short of it is they all bonded around causal models. Everyone could basically draw as a causal model. And some of the fun, fascinating things that I found is like when a public health person drew out their causal model, another person basically said, that one box you have there is my entire field. And then they zoomed that out and unpacked it. And then the expert says, that's where I am. I'm in that little box. And I zoomed the whole thing out, right? When you start drawing in causal models, you start to be able to see how all of us who right now we all look like we're separate because we're living in a data-driven associative world, how we actually all connect. It's really powerful. Now, are we right? Of course not. But at least now we know what we're talking about and we have a sense on like what was the underlying assertions that we were making. I think it's very powerful to think in causal models. Now I'm just going to pivot a little bit because I think this is not all of the problem. I've actually, David, last time he and I were in a similar talk, he asked a very simple question that I've been asking myself ever since. How do you know? It's a really simple, but it's a really profound and really important question, right? And so one of the questions I've gotten obsessed with lately is, how do you know what to solve and when you solved it? That's actually a really hard question, right? Going through this, you can so easily spend your time spinning your wheels trying to solve something, and then it never goes anywhere, right? Like I heard from Russ Glasgow once, I don't know where he got this quote, and I actually have asked him, and he didn't send me the reference, so take this with a grain of salt. But I think he gave me a quote once, he said that he's seen a statistic that 86% or somewhere around that of scientific studies never get used for any possible use. Oh, right? That is painful. In my mind, that is because we don't know what we're solving and when we solved it, okay? And so now just moving forward, how do we actually solve that? Part of it, I think, is actually, this book by David Weinberg I think is really interesting. So here's their the subline. Too big to know. Rethinking knowledge when facts are no longer facts, when experts are everywhere, and the smartest person in the room is the room. What does that mean? Why is that? So what do they mean by the smartest person in the room? Basically, the idea that we're increasingly realizing that we've classically built our knowledge enterprise around this idea of a hierarchy. You can hear it in the word principal investigator, PI, right? That principal investigator will be able to understand a problemscape so well that they will be able to, figure it out and solve a problem. Now, what does that mean? What happens if that's not true? What if someone can't understand the full complexity of a problem? Well, then it shifts your thinking away from a hierarchy, the smartest person in the room, to a network, is the room. And so really, this is asking the question of what happens to knowledge when you take it off of paper and we take it out of a hierarchical structure and put it onto a network. Okay? And so if you want to understand the epistemology on why our world is changing and why it just seems like we're so uncertain about everything, this is really important. But now that's kind of the epistemological side. There's another side to this as well, which is, in my mind, starting to actually ask the question of, well then, what we need to do is we need to figure out what are our grounding functions. And it shifts us in, there's two things in my mind. Basically asking the question of what is success and who and when, where am I helping? And forcing ourselves to be bounded to a niche is the phrase I use, because I think there's a lot we can learn if we think in more of an evolutionary perspective about this. Now, why is this important, and how is this linked to the networks idea? Well, this is a book that just recently came out, New Power by Jeremy Hyman's and Henry Timms. Basically, is arguing for this idea that power is moving away from these hierarchical structures, what they say an old power model, which is like a currency, to instead a new power model that functions across networks. It works more like a current. So currency versus current. We're moving more towards these current. Now, there's actually problems with this, of course. There's ways it can be manipulated and whatnot. But this is really powerful and important for us to understand. And in my mind, it comes back to, if we start to think about knowledge as distributed across a network, it starts to force us to actually know that we actually have a different way of understanding what is the problem we're solving and how do we know when we solved it, okay? And as a very concrete example, I've been working with this patient community, OpenAPS. This is Dana Lewis, a friend and colleague of mine. We have a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant together. The long and the short of it is Dana is a patient who just built her own artificial pancreas system, open sourced it online, and now there's about 700 people who have used the instructions that she's built to build their own versions of an artificial pancreas system. Is that scary? Some might say yes. I also think you should ask that's a much longer question that I'd love to actually unpack with you. That was a long focus of my previous one, right? And an interesting question you need to ask is, what is safe? And how do you know when success is, right? One problem with type 1 diabetes is you're born with a disease that's trying to kill you. So you're damned if you do, if you're damned if you don't, right? So that's actually an interesting problem for us to understand. There's actually a psychological bias around this that we have towards inaction versus action, right? So there's some interesting questions that we need to unpack, but noticing here that the core summary point here is knowing that increasingly there's going to be some people in a network who have a deep understanding of needs, and there's going to be other people who have tools. And part of the question is, how do we actually do that matchmaking service between them? And so as a very last step, this is actually what I've been trying to think through in terms of the agile science work, is basically trying to understand how do we sort of flatten our work such that we think more about creating a clear sense of what is success and going all those measures that we talked about, the preconditions that actually work, the niche, if you will, and then with that, then matching that with the appropriate methods and use of data. That's what I've been using the phrase of optimization. And then ultimately, if you find a solution that works, you can start asking the question of reusing. This is where the generalization comes into play, but notice it's secondary to asking if it worked. The risk of the old model with a randomized controlled trial is, say you have a bad intervention, you compare it to a worse intervention. You run your trial and you find that bad is better than worse. What do you still have? Bad. You still have bad, right? That's because you weren't necessarily bound to clinically meaningful criteria of success. So let's first get success, and then we can ask where else it might work. And so just finally, to wrap this up at the last point, basically the stuff that I've been thinking about in terms of how agile science changes the process, what makes it agile is basically moving from a linear to more of an agile model, meaning managing the inherent uncertainty that exists in the problems we're working on and using baby steps to solve these problems via iteration and sprints. I would love to tell you the longer story about how Dana moved from basically she couldn't sleep at nights and she wanted an alarm that would wake her up into building an artificial pancreas system. But it basically went through this sort of baby step model. Second one, from hierarchical to networked. So basically recognizing that oftentimes no one person is going to fully be able to understand it. It's the classic, blind men touching the elephant model, right? How do we actually figure out that facilitation across that? And it basically, one of the forces that I've been thinking about is really consciously rejecting the notions that hierarchy sets up around knowledge. And then how do we make it science? In my mind, there are two key elements. It's moving from trying to strive for general insights towards precision, basically grounding our science in when, where, for whom, and in what state are we actually helping, knowing that that actually is important and part of our causal model. And then finally, moving from the targeting statistical generalization to causal models, where every experiment is actually a test of a causal model and using that to organize our structures together. So as a key summary, hype evidence gap exists, plausible reasons, there's a disconnect between operations and concepts, and a mismatch between the methods and problem complexity. What do? Greater emphasis on operations over concepts, more focus on causal models over statistical generalization, make it agile, basically better manage our uncertainty and solve with networks, and make it science, target precision, and use causal models. Thank you very much.
So we do have time for questions. If you had a question, please move to the aisle microphone and identify yourself. But Dr. Hekler, thank you so much for that talk. If I may just ask the first question maybe.
Please.
I'm always interested in application thereof and having understood that one Fitbit doesn't fit every one of us. What other features do you think any one of those technological devices would have to be able to do and perform in order to make them more individualized and actually potentially deliver any results, any improvements whatsoever?
Right. So I mentioned the hype evidence gap in terms of the tools that don't seem to be working, but that doesn't mean there aren't some that are working. And my experience is that those ones that are working tend to be, just as you said, taking into account attributes of the person, place, and time. And so one example is a colleague of mine, Mark Adams. He's been doing work on adaptive goal setting, which was inspiration for some of our work. And he's run randomized controlled trials showing that is more valuable than others. Now, what does his adaptive intervention strategy do? Functionally, it's basically taking into account their past history and making these small micro adjustments to the suggestions that we're doing. Now, so one part of it is basically having clarity on the context, but then the other part of it is also, it was deeply grounded in behavioral science work that has been translated from animal models into human models, and that's basically operant theory. And so building on a lot of that prior science, there's a lot of value there, but notice, particularly when it comes to like operant theory work, that is a style of science that was not asking if questions, it was asking how questions. And so it gave him a causal explanatory model with which to work forward on. The work that I've seen that's working well within these digital healths tends to start from robust causal explanatory models.
Thank you.
Eric, quick question.
Yes.
You talk a lot about preconditions. And so if you are designing a study, so every individual in your sample comes in with a different precondition.
Right.
Right? So when that happens, how do you actually then, I don't know how you put it, how do you then, with all these preconditions that every individual bring to the design, does that change how we now think about sample size?
That's a great question.
Yeah. So how do you then deal with that? Because you could have millions of preconditions already starting in a study design.
Right.
So then what will be the power calculation that we have? Does that now apply, or do we have to rethink it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the short summary is that the key question, you are totally right, and the flip to that is knowing that you're always going to make an assumption. And that's true with any power calculation you're using for, power of a randomized controlled trial or otherwise, right? The Judea Pearl, and I would argue, can extend this argument, basically says that you need to have clarity on the preconditions that matter for you, right? So you don't need to study all preconditions. You need to do the ones that actually matter for the causal model you're studying. And so it's more about actually drawing out and having clarity about that. Then what you do is when you draw out that causal model, you then start to use the do calculus, as he calls it, to basically actually get clarity on, well, which one of these do we actually need to measure? Which one of these do we actually need to articulate as something that would be inclusion or exclusion or eligibility criteria? Which one of these do we consciously want to make sure we actually include variability on so that we don't unintentionally subsample out and then fall into problems like the Simpsons paradox where we have a different response in a full population versus a subsample. But the short answer is it all comes down to having clarity of your causal models. But then you don't have to study everything. But the key is knowing that you just made an assumption. But again, that's always true. It's just that oftentimes we're not forced to articulate fully what our assumptions were. And therefore, we can kind of hide it underneath this veil. But I'd be happy to talk in more detail about that. But the short answer is causal models. So, yes?
Thank you for an interesting talk. I wondered if you could give us more insight in how we overcome two big problems in the models you've suggested. One is in networking, trying to have some criteria to judge the other field. Usually we can judge or get some idea of the expertise in our own field, but not necessarily in other fields. And the second is how can we avoid jargon, because each field has jargon, and
Totally.
that's a barrier to understanding causal or any other models.
Oh, I love those questions. So in terms of the first, judging each other, right, I mean, one of the ways that I tend to think about disciplines is that you're basically building your intuitions, right? Such that when you read an article or you look at the scientific work, you can have you don't have to think rationally about what was good, you just have an intuitive sense of, yes, that fit with our paradigm and therefore is good or bad, right? So I bring that up to say, one of the ways that I've been trying to move past disciplinary divides is to force myself not to trust my intuitions, to know that I have a certain criteria of success and it might be different from you. So as a very concrete example, let's just say there's different ways that you can use data, okay? So classic epidemiology and often health sciences as well, we use data in a sense where it's often a comparator style model, where we want to compare it to a population, as I already said, or to a control condition as another example, right? And so that's a statistical model that's bound around averages, and it's built around the idea that you have some form of hypothesis. Another way of using data could be a machine learning style. This is now a data-driven, non-hypothesis-driven approach where what success is for that model is, do you find clusters in the data? Another model could be something called reinforcement learning within computer science. This is you basically know what success is, and you want to figure out what makes an individual person, notice here, this is the difference, it's data-driven but individual relevant. You want to get them to do it. So this is Amazon getting you to click more, right? It doesn't care why you do it. It's just going to keep throwing things, and then whatever you respond positively to, it'll do that more. Another model, N of 1 style, is basically the control systems work. Success there is basically, can I make future predictions for a person, right? And so all of this is to say, one of the ways that I've been trying to move past this question on the disciplines is actually asking the question of, what is success, particularly for the methods that I'm using? And then also, how do I tend to think about problems within my discipline, my intuitions, right? If I'm in public health, I'm going to see public health etiological problems as root causes. But that might actually bias me to not understand the other people's perspective on this. So asking the question on what is my causes that I like to look at and what is my definition of success? And then asking the earlier question of what is going on here? Is that definition of success and is that problem space actually appropriate for this? Usually that helps to move it past. Now the second question around how do we get past jargon? This is just the classic, what did you just say? Can you define that and give me 3 examples? And those examples are really key. And just keep forcing it. Every time you hear something, just have that conversation over and over. And oftentimes, I think you could learn the most from just having that conversation about defining things and getting examples. The examples are key, though. Really, really key.
Just to build a bit on Johanna's question, how do you address the bias? And you started to go there a bit, but to me there can be bias in if you're associating with like-minded individuals, how do you manage that, either in the system that you create or through the models you were describing?
Yeah, what an awesome question. I mean, this comes out in terms of our eligibility criteria as well, just as more of a concrete example within our work, right? If we've subsampled something, we have limited range, right? And therefore, but then we run it, and then particularly we tend to use, a linear regression or other variation to do some sort of interpolation or extrapolation from that. But that's not necessarily true, right? So how do we get past that sort of problem space? In my mind, part of the question is I think, well, let me give it more with an example, right? The only way that I started to understand frequentist statistics is by learning Bayesian statistics. The only way I could understand the United States culture is to leave, right? Why? Because when you're so enmeshed something, you literally can't see the assumptions you're making and the biases you're making, right? And so for me, the thing that I find most valuable is forcing myself not to live in my own discipline. The building I live, one of the reasons I went to UCSD is because of the building I sit in. It's Cal IT2. This tech summit that ILSI ran last year was in this building. I sit next to roboticists, mechanical engineers, ethicists, artists. We are all in the same building intentionally to force ourselves to just sit in another person's world. And having that space to really be curious about what they care about and why can help to get us past those inherent biases. And then once we can at least see it, we can kind of map out the landscape of plausible variability. Then we can ask the question of, well, who are we helping and what is success in this context? But now we at least have seen it. And then we can try to reduce the likelihood of us, the classic problem of we have a hammer and we see a lot of nails, right? This allows us not to only see nails in the world, right? But that is often what happens when we stay boxed up in our own little disciplines. But I don't want to take more time. So. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.